Our panelists this afternoon are Mr. David Hearst, on my immediate left, and Dr. Tareq Baconi. A third speaker, Mr. Mohammad Soudan, had an urgent appointment with the Home Office and he's on his way. However, we'll start without him and extend the time to the two speakers and of course give you more time for discussions. The original time allotted to each speaker was 10, so we'll increase it to about 12 or 15. I'll start the session with Mr. Tareq Baconi, Dr. Tareq Baconi. He holds a PhD from King's College and is a research scholar at the Middle East Institute at Columbia University. He specializes in Palestine, Islamic movements, and geopolitics in the Middle East. I welcome Dr. Tareq.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. Thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to this panel and for assembling this wonderful conference. It's a timely conference to be having. Over the course of the next 10 minutes, so I'd like to offer Hamas as a case study, which offers insight into the interplay between the Muslim Brotherhood ideology and principles of democracy. As we all know, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Palestinian territories, established in 1987 in the early days of the First Intifada. For the duration of the first uprising and throughout the 1990s, Hamas acted primarily as a resistance organization. It employed both violent and non-violent tactics to express its opposition to the peace process and to attempt to derail the negotiations which were taking place between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Throughout the first half of its being, Hamas existed outside the political establishment, which had been created by the Oslo Accords in 1993. Apart from a brief period where Hamas's leadership considered engagement in this political establishment through the Palestinian Authority which had been created, in the legislative elections in 1996, Hamas's role was fundamentally external to the Palestinian polity. This changed by the end of the Second Intifada, when Hamas decided to partake in the legislative elections which eventually took place in 2006. It is through this election and the movement's experiences over the subsequent decades that I want to discuss Hamas's engagement with democratic principles. The decision to participate in the legislative elections was preceded by a period of intense military resistance carried out by Hamas, as well, of course, as by the other Palestinian factions, in an attempt to force Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. The failure of this military strategy, the failure of Hamas's resistance, forced the movement by the second half of the Second Intifada to consider expanding its resistance beyond the military dimension. I refer to Hamas's efforts to do so as what I call the movement's political resistance. It is my contention that through its engagement with the Palestinian polity, Hamas sought to create a newly reformed political establishment, which is firmly rooted in the notion of resisting the Israeli occupation. Resistance in Hamas's case expanded beyond military operations to include non-military political aspects. These encompass things such as creating a Palestinian political economy which is no longer dependent on foreign aid or on Israel's economy. It also includes things such as refusing to succumb to international pressure, which forces Palestinians to engage in peace negotiations. By participating in democratic politics, Hamas sought constitutional legitimacy and agreed to work with other factions in policymaking and in government building to institutionalize resistance as a national policy. It understood its role within the Legislative Council would be to politically strengthen its own vision for the Palestinian struggle. And the movement understood this as developing a voice in crafting legislation and policy, and even blocking legislation which it deemed detrimental. So in effect, Hamas sought to move the Palestinian political leadership away from a path which is so as being defined by concessions and endless negotiations. Hamas very effectively adopted democratic principles which underpin the Legislative Council elections. Its language came to include words such as demokratiya, democracy, intikhabat, elections, islah, reform. and sharaka, partnership. In dealing with the Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip, Musa Abu Marzouk, who's a prominent leader within the movement, offered the following vision for filling up the governance vacuum left in the wake of the Israeli departure. And here I quote, "The Palestinian people will fill the vacuum following the withdrawal quite naturally. It would not be Hamas on its own who will lead, but the Palestinian people in their entirety, with their masses and their national factions all united. These will collectively fill the vacuum and run Palestinian affairs in the best form of administration. We will create a united national and democratic environment of the highest caliber," end quote. The movement's vision was based on inclusiveness and plurality politics. Its slogan for Gaza post-Israel's disengagement was "Shuraka fil dam, shuraka fil qarar," which means partners in blood, partners in decision-making. In the run-up to the elections, Hamas put forward its political platform of change and reform and mobilized the Palestinian masses around a new vision for their struggle, excelling in its approach to electioneering and to mobilization of masses. Throughout its engagement with the democratic political process, and in the early days following its election victory, Hamas theoretically demonstrated a clear readiness to engage in key democratic principles, including notions of representative governance, pluralistic politics, and the protection of the rights of minorities. It is unclear whether in reality, and given the chance to fully partake in governance, Hamas would have acted on these principles. Following its election victory, a stringent blockade was imposed on the Palestinian establishment, which ultimately facilitated the rupture between Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Fatah in the West Bank. I will not go into the details of the blockade here, except to say that it actively prevented and continues to prevent the formation of a unity Palestinian government, and as such, undermined Hamas's continued engagement in the democratic process. Which brings us to the second aspect of the case study, which I wish to expand on in this talk. Following the separation between Gaza and the West Bank, Hamas was in a position to act was in the position of acting as the sole authority of a significant Palestinian constituency. By exploring the movement's rule since 2007, a starkly different picture emerges regarding Hamas's readiness and willingness to engage in the democratic process. With time, Hamas's governance in the Gaza Strip took the form of a creeping authoritarianism, which has gradually swept into the Strip. In conflict with many of the political pillars which initially propelled the movement to victory in 2006, Hamas is currently exposed to accusations of political opacity, lack of accountability, and a refusal to countenance plurality or political opposition. Over the past few years, Hamas has asserted its dominance by physically quashing any political opposition. As its position strengthened over the years, many argue that its authoritarianism has expanded into more repressive cultural and social agendas. It's not that the social or cultural agendas are more conservative, which could suggest an illiberal democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. It's that these agendas are repressive, which suggests a key principle of democracy, that of the protection of minorities, has in fact been eroded. Still, suffering from a persistent international blockade which continues to undermine Palestinian reconciliation, Hamas has to safeguard its rule against more extreme ideologies and elements that threaten the stability of the Gaza Strip, most recently from outside the Strip in the Sinai Peninsula. Perhaps as a result of this, Hamas is encouraged to maintain an effective stronghold on the Strip and to prevent more transparent and inclusive rule. Others would argue that it is Hamas's inherent authoritarianism which, given the chance, has finally emerged over the territory. It cannot be conclusively said whether it's the blockade or Hamas's internal mechanisms which have ultimately facilitated this transition from a party engaged in pluralistic and democratic politics into effectively an authoritarian governing regime. But it is my belief that under the current marginalization policies adopted by the international community, there is no hope for a more democratic rule in Gaza or in the Palestinian territories more generally. As a case study, Hamas's experience demonstrates that given the chance, Islamist parties are capable and extremely successful at adopting key democratic principles and integrating those into their political platforms. In the case of Hamas, the movement successfully integrated the tenets of the democratic process into its vision for the Palestinian struggle and presented the people with a platform which they could support. Allowing Hamas to take part in the democratic process encouraged the movement to play by the rules of the game. In contrast, the blockade and further marginalization have precipitated a reversal in this openness to the democratic process. But as I had mentioned, it is unclear that Hamas would not have reverted to authoritarianism even in the absence of a blockade. It's therefore difficult to draw conclusions with any certainty regarding the interplay between the democratic principles and the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology seen solely from the perspective of Hamas. And this is important because Hamas is not representative of the entire Muslim Brotherhood, and it has very exceptional circumstances. Counter to my conclusions, many critics would argue that it is precisely marginalization, precisely repression, which encourages Islamic parties to adopt democratic principles. Such critics would argue that to counter the risk of obsolescence, parties which are being marginalized would induce reform so they could become relevant in the political process. The lesson, to me at least, is that until we allow Islamic parties the chance to rule in an unobstructed manner, until we allow them to gain experience in governance, to enable the constituencies which elect them to determine how they transition from political opposition to self-rule, the answer to this issue will continue to elude us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tareq. He looked at the Muslim Brotherhood experience, specific reference to the case of Hamas and its governorship of the Gaza Strip. I found the presentation quite thought-provoking, and I look forward to the discussions. I hope that you have noted some of the salient features of Dr. Tareq's argument. In my view, essentially, he argues that Hamas has drifted from being a popular movement into an authoritarian system, as it were, in the Gaza Strip, without perhaps, in my view, taking note of the fact that the situation in Gaza is unlike that of Egypt. Here we have an occupation. Here we have a movement committed to resistance and liberation, as opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is trying to create a space for itself within a democratic environment. So I look forward to the discussions. However, it's my privilege to introduce a friend and colleague, Sir David Hearst, a former lead foreign writer at The Guardian and now chief editor of the Middle East Eye in London. He's a commentator on Palestinian and Middle Eastern affairs in several news platforms, Al Jazeera, notably the BBC and others. My pleasure to introduce David.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me into such knowledgeable and privileged company. I feel quite out of place here. And I'm no expert on the Brotherhood or its ideology, but I would like to kick against the premise of the debate, which one of them is that at least in Egypt, less so in Tunisia, but certainly in Egypt, that what's happened to the Brotherhood in Egypt has anything to do with its ideology. I don't think it has. And I'd really like to sort of make two points here. One is the nature of the struggle in hand, which is clearer now than it was 4 years ago. And the second is the regional environment, which is also much, much clearer than it was. And one of the problems I have with the premise of the question is that, in fact, if you take what's going on in any one Arab country, you cannot do this in isolation to the sheer number of foreign actors that are trying to interfere in that. And indeed, the biggest example of what's happening at the moment, for instance, certainly in Iraq and Syria, is that the norm of sovereignty is being challenged by the norm of sectarianism. sectarian state is taking over some of the aspects of the sovereign state. So when you talk about Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptian state, or you talk about Muslim Brotherhood and power, you're talking about it today, 4 years, in a completely different context than you would when 4 years ago you did not have 4 failed states in the region. And you did not have ISIS, and you did not have the total meltdown of Sykes-Picot and those borders. Now, it can be argued that the melting process of borders that is happening reinforces states. You could argue that it is reinforcing the Jordanian state. I don't happen to believe it is, but it's certainly putting up physical barriers to it. But I think, again, this is one reason why I think the regional argument is really very, very important to discussing how any individual actor tries to establish democracy or is helped by elections in a particular place, because it presupposes that we are all talking about sovereign states. And I think we're talking about sovereign states less so than we were before. That's like almost like a side point. But let me just go back to my original point about the nature of the struggle. I had the opportunity of interviewing Morsi about a week before the coup. I sort of reflected on what he told me, or what he hinted to me at the time, and what I was seeing in front of me. And as a journalist, it's always very difficult, because you're there in a historic event. You don't know something is about to happen. But you can see all sorts of signs in front of you that don't make sense then, but do make sense now. One of them, in fact, was that we weren't actually being interviewed. I wasn't interviewing him in the presidential palace at all. I was interviewing him in another palace. And the explanation for that was, it's not convenient for us to meet there. But the real explanation was that they had actually, the leadership, Morsi, had been kicked out of the presidential palace 3 weeks before, as had his entire staff. So not only was he not in control, he wasn't even in his own office when I interviewed him. The Brotherhood were propelled to power, not just ill-equipped for mediating and handling it, but also, I would argue, much too early in the game. They were trying to build a democratic structure in conditions where the old one had not been dismantled. Of course, you'd be taken past in Tunisia, the burnt-out remains of the RCD tower block, and say that was where the old regime resided. But in fact, the lights were still on. To all intents and purposes, the old regime and the network existed, and it existed in spades, and still does exist. So that it was competing actively, again, in the same political space to tear down anything that the so-called post-revolutionary regime was trying to build. So the task itself of writing a constitution, when there were no founding fathers, of sitting in a parliament which was boycotted by the opposition, of coalition government where there were no partners to share the political risk, was, I would argue, from the start doomed. Morsi thought that you could accrue power through democracy, and I think he was naive. I don't think in those circumstances you can reform power from inside. I think the reformist agenda was fundamentally doomed in those circumstances. Morsi sacked 700 generals. This is just one case in point, there are many others, but he sacked 700 generals of the Interior Ministry and 3/4 of SCUF. And yet the institutional unity and purpose of the Egyptian army remained untouched. Sisi wasn't working for him as defense minister, he was working for Tahani. And you contrast that to see Morsi's speech when he said, when he referred to the army as his men of gold. He also said to me, the first thing I asked him was, do you have the support of the army? He said, what a ridiculous question, of course I do. That was a week before he couldn't say anything else. He knew he was trapped. In Tunisia, I'll come back to Tunisia later, but Enada thought that a coalition government would be enough to defeat the deep state. And that in itself was a miscalculation. So, all the way through, what was happening was that the newly elected leaders had no levers in a post-totalitarian state. They didn't have the media, they couldn't control their own image, they didn't have enough businessmen on their side, they didn't have a consensus, there were no agreed rules of the road. And as a result, the Brotherhood in Egypt, and to a lesser extent, but again, I'll come back to that in Tunisia, were talking one language, and everyone else was talking something completely different. The Brotherhood were playing naively, I think, by one set of rules, and everyone else was playing by a different set. Democracy, rule of law, due process, transitional peace, reconciliation. In those circumstances was wish fulfillment. Who were the Democrats? Well, was it the forces of the old regime who simply wanted to entrench corruption and privileges and wouldn't even allow, even under Morsi, wouldn't even allow any oversight over the army budget? The single most important thing that was needed by a civilian president was, any president, was oversight over the army's budget. And Sisi would not allow it. And still the relationship continued. Was it were the liberals who themselves could not win elections and who refused coalitions? No, they were not. They certainly were not behaving democratically. They made us think of themselves as Democrats, but there wasn't. They were behaving to tear the whole system down. Was it the media who, for large sums of money, peddled lies like the pyramids were being sold or the Suez Canal was just about to be given to Qatar? No. Was it the left who regarded the Brotherhood as a bigger enemy than the army, and to this day refused to forgive, I refuse to forgive, and also refuse to combine forces when there's an overwhelmingly common enemy? I don't think they behaved democratically, and I don't think they're behaving democratically now. So you had the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood are not liberals, but they did behave democratically. And if you think back over the battles that Morsi had in his year, and you ask yourself, you rerun the main disputes that he had with the judges, with the judiciary, would anyone now say that this institution was worth preserving after the judgments that they have given out, after the kangaroo courts that they have presided over, after the mass death sentences, where you don't even bother with identification before sentencing someone to death? The absolutely most basic, most primitive rules of due process are being ignored. Were they worth fighting for? No, they have to all be cleared out. Is it the Ministry of Interior, the police force, who rape women, or whose thugs and assassins are worse than ever? Is it the media, who blatantly just take orders from Sisi? Their script is written by Kamil, his chief of staff. So my argument is, the issue is not about the Muslim Brotherhood and democracy. The real dynamic is between democracy and power. And the real task of the Brotherhood in these circumstances, I would argue, is not now a reformist one. I don't think reformism can get anywhere. It's a revolutionary one. So stop studying democracy, stop trying to defend yourself in your own goalmouth, and start looking at the history of the French, the European, the Russian revolutions. Start looking at what happened in the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And you're in for much messier, much more long-hauled, much more turbulent periods of massive social, political change, which is inherently violent. So that's my first point. The second point, I think, is the regional environment, because the other thing that was happening was that you had a process in which the Democrats were on one side and the money was on the other side. That anyone who took over in Egypt had to fight the combined forces of Saudi Arabia, the financial forces of Saudi Arabia, of the United Arab Emirates, of Kuwait, to a lesser extent of Oman. The only two powers they had on their side were Turkey and Qatar. And Qatar is tiny and Turkey is non-Arabic. They didn't have the levers to fight this. And now we see that the regional landscape is changing. It's not a landscape, it's more like a field of conflict. This conflict stretches geographically over the entire region, from Tunis to Baghdad, from north to south, from the Mediterranean to the Arab Peninsula. As I say, 4 states have failed. A 5th, Egypt, is becoming more and more unstable. 2 countries are on the brink of civil war. 2 countries are in a state of war, and 2 more, Yemen and Libya, are on the brink of it. There are interventions taking all over the place, such as in Libya, unidentified bombers. And also Tunisians and Saudis are fighting with Daesh in Iraq and in Syria. Everyone, in other words, is in everyone else's backyard. This is not an atmosphere in which free elections can be held, constitutions can be written, parliaments can sit. It's a regional power structure between clearly defined and heavily armed forces. So the lesson from this is you need to defend yourself. I mean, Gaza has shown this time and time again, but Libya shows this as well. And alas, peacefulness is not stronger than bullets. Now, the exception to this is Tunisia, where Ennahda has voluntarily left power amid a rolling coup punctuated by political assassinations for which they were blamed. And they have compromised all the way down the line. They vetoed, for instance, a political exclusion law, which would have made it impossible for Essebsi to run. They gave opposition members seats in parliament. They insisted on dates, procedures, elections, and a refusal to play now the oppositional role, even when they are in opposition. The leadership of Ennahda are trying to kill an old regime in a warm embrace. We will see whether this works. I think the jury is out on what Ennahda is trying to do. And I think the acid test will come the election after next. If Ennahda is allowed to win it and return peacefully to power, and if indeed it does win it, then the tactics of the leadership of Ennahda would have been fully vindicated, and Ghannouchi deserves the Peace Prize. If, however, they are once again excluded from power, the whole gambit would look extremely different in Tunisia. Now, Tunisia is a very, very small country, and it also has a separate history. So what happens in Tunisia doesn't necessarily pertain in Egypt. And I remember Rashid Ghannouchi practically in tears about what was going on in Egypt, and the refrain all the time that the Egyptians were our cousins, not our brothers. There's quite a lot of anger of how the Brotherhood behaved in Egypt, at least from the view of Tunisia. So all along the line, I think very, very harsh lessons are in realpolitik are being learned, and they're being paid for in blood. I think there are 3 trends now, all of which are positive and are changing what I've given is a very, very gloomy talk. I think the Brotherhood itself is going through the biggest leadership change in its history. It's a generational change. And the average age of its new leadership has gone from something like 75 to 40. This generation have been educated in the hard school of failure. I don't think they're going to repeat the same mistakes. And as in any conflict, I think their primary loyalty is to their peers, to their fellow band of brothers and sisters, not necessarily to history, to tradition, to hierarchical and vertical structures. Secondly, I think the composition of the international forces stacked up against anyone in Egypt trying to be a democrat is changing. I think there's a change of management in Saudi Arabia, and who, under the late King Abdullah, made repression of political Islam in any form the #1 foreign policy objective. The Brotherhood were to him a greater foe possibly than nearly there. And I think there are changes now. I think there are changes not only when you examine who the new people in power are in Saudi Arabia, and most important one of that is bin Nayef. Examine who his friends are. His friends are senior Turkish diplomats. Or who Salman's friend was. And that's the Emir of Qatar. And so I think, again, one doesn't want to exaggerate, and one doesn't want, certainly doesn't want to you don't want to enter as a journalist the realm of wish fulfillment. But I think it's not unreasonable to expect change, not only in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but Saudi Arabia and the Brotherhood, and Saudi Arabia and Hamas. I think Saudi Arabia has a particularly good opportunity to change its relationship with Hamas, just as Hamas is now looking again towards funds and towards Iran. And it'll be interesting to watch that particular one. But why is it changing? I don't think it's changing because of any love of political Islam or any love of the Brotherhood. It's changing because the old regime weakened Saudi Arabia. There are black flags to the north. As I say, sovereignty is less than it was. There is Al-Qaeda to the south. And there's an Iranian-backed, Hezbollah-trained militia in control of Sana'a. If this is what victory looks like, it is chaos from a pragmatic Saudi Arabian view. And the third element, the final element of what's changing, is that I started by saying Morsi wasn't in control. I'll end by saying Sisi is not in control. And he's not in control because he's multiplying the number of his enemies, and that has nothing to do with the Brotherhood. It's to do with the sheer number of people who are dying and who are protesting, who are secular, who are young, who are old, who are Egyptians, and they are rising up in protest. So my conclusion is that when the story is over, I have a feeling that none of the post-Sisi regime people will be familiar to us today. The old guard will not come back, and nor will the old party leaders come back. I think they've played a major part in history through suffering, imprisonment, and death, but a new generation will take over and be on hand to carry out the radical restructuring that Egypt needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Very insightful, informative, and again, provocative ideas from a journalist with immense experience in the region. I've had the privilege of traveling around the region with him and meeting some of these people. I'll open up the floor now for questions. Please keep them brief. So we have about 20 minutes ahead of us, and we want a very good and fair discussion. John.
You've talked about the Brotherhood in Egypt, Hamas, Tunisia, and a bit in other countries, but you haven't really said anything about Syria. Could you talk about both the Brotherhood in Syria, to the extent that it's relevant today, and maybe about movements that might be, shall we say, closely in the same, of the same ethos?
I'll take three questions at a time. Take the gentleman here and the lady at the back. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. So Jonathan Brown. Mainly for David Hearst, you seem to contradict yourself, I think, or have misunderstood, when you implied that the Muslim Brotherhood type movements kind of ought to move away from participating in democratic elections they're not allowed to win and see themselves as revolutionary forces, but then went on to say the current political climate might be changing to give them opportunities. Could you expand on that?
Okay.
Thanks.
Please, at the back.
Samira Al-Khawalde. I think you compared things to the French Revolution, that lessons can be learned. But don't you think that after 9/11, it was very hard for the Muslim Brotherhood to take any other line, being, all people looking at how they will behave when they reach power? So I think any movement away, even if they had to, because they believed in this democratic path from the beginning, if they moved away a little bit from it, won't this discredit their whole mission, their whole beliefs and their image as well? Thank you.
I think Syria is now in a completely different state. It was when the Brotherhood were there, and I go back to that the whole question of the effects of the loss of sovereignty. I mean, there are now maps being withdrawn of what Syria and Iraq would and should look like, with a Sunni state in the middle, and they are being taken seriously by the State Department. We're not talking. I mean, the original uprising, which was both democratic and civilian and non-sectarian, is now a matter of history, and there's no very little trace of it left. So the Brotherhood in those circumstances has either, some people have peeled off it, or it has disappeared, or it finds itself less well armed than all the other groups. But this is a civil war. This is not. We're not talking about politics. We're talking about militias and the redrawing of boundaries. Jonathan, yes, I contradict myself. I always do. I think you slightly misunderstood me, though. I mean, I think things have to happen in a certain order. And one of them is what I was referring to when I talked about a revolutionary movement is a movement that clears away the old regime and all its institutions. When that happens, and after that has happened, and the reforming of all institutions, that is a long process. And it's not necessarily a democratic one, but it has to actually happen. After that happens, you can then have free elections and you can start rebuilding the actual society. But you can't do that now with an army that refuses to go back to barracks, or which considers itself a state within a state. You actually have to break the power of the Egyptian army over its budget, over the state, over people's lives. In order to establish real democratic accountability, you have to have real judges, not paper judges, not grotesque images of judges, not the judge who sentences people in absentia without any due process. They're not judges. So how can you have transitional justice with the judges or with justice in that particular state? That's what I'm talking about revolutionary. Everything has to change. And actually, I disagree about 9/11. I thought, that somehow the Muslim Brotherhood had to play a back foot. I don't think it has. I think it has a very, very powerful case. And I think precisely when the Arab Spring broke, the Arab Spring was the lowest point of Al-Qaeda. It was the lowest point of the Takfiris. It was the lowest point of the Islamic State. It is when all political ground has shrunk that you see the black flags turning up. And as speakers have said before, it is the biggest bulwark against extremists. It is the absence of the Brotherhood that actually creates Takfiri Islam. It is the absence of a voice for Sunni Islamists anywhere that created. And I think that is one motivation for Saudi Arabia, because they feel it. They absolutely feel that they're losing control of Sunni Islam. Again, these are huge sweeping statements. And John Esposito is going to shoot me down in many. But I don't mean to be so sweeping, but the principle is it is no accident that you now have the Islamic State as powerful as it is when you have in Syria and Iraq the Muslim Brotherhood as weak as it is.
Okay. Just to briefly answer your question also about the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, just to step back to the period slightly before what David talked about, we must remember that in the early days, when it was still seen as a democratic uprising, a democratic revolt against Bashar al-Assad's regime, Hamas took a stand. It very clearly took all its leadership outside of Syria, and it very clearly and strategically aligned itself with the people, what it saw as the struggle against authoritarianism. It aligned itself with what it saw as a democratic uprising, which was also another example of Hamas engaging somewhat or being open with the democratic process very effectively, and aligning itself with the sentiment of wanting change, wanting reform, wanting more inclusive governance.
Thank you very much, Tareq. We have another 3 rounds. Mohammad.
Mohammad Kozba, the Vice President of the Muslim Association of Britain. My question is, taking into consideration the recent development in the last few weeks from the death of the King Abdullah, and the changes taking place now in the Gulf, in the Gulf in general, and the leaks, the recent leaks about Sisi trying to, grab money from the Gulf in this way. Where is the coup is going in the future, or where is Egypt is going in the future? Can we see another revolution soon or later? And can democracy prevail again in Egypt? Thank you.
Sorry. Both speakers seem to be suggesting that we have to accept a period of non-democracy before either of these countries, particularly Gaza and Egypt, are actually ready for democracy. But isn't it rather wishful thinking to think that any sectarian-led government is ever really going to introduce democracy in a proper sense? I mean, is there any example in history of a sectarian government that has treated its religious minorities, or I may say women, because all sects seem to be led by men, with any degree of equality?
Noor Ahmed, you mentioned that peacefulness is not stronger than bullets and that revolutions are inherently violent. And at the same time, there are comparisons with Syria or with Libya, and we see how that route went down. So how do you justify that?
Rosemary Hollis, I wonder if, since you're going to address the question that came from over here about experimenting with democracy inside one state, can I endorse very strongly what David Hearst said about these are not isolated boxes within which you can have experiments with democracy. Every single state is being interfered with in massive ways, structural as well as direct. And we're part of that. So I don't think there is a perfect case study for democracy and Islamist parties across the whole region.
Okay, David?
I'm sure change is underway. I'm not sure how radical that change will be. And it could simply be that Saudi Arabia reverts to a traditional role which it had under King Fahd of being more neutral, of not being an active participant, but of being a forum where other people's conflicts were resolved. And I'm thinking certainly of what happened with Lebanon, what happened briefly with the Mecca Agreement with Hamas and Fatah, the role it played there, almost like an adjudicator. And I think it might return to that role. Even that would have an implication for Sisi, because I think if money, which he desperately needs, and the budget is hemorrhaging funds, he's running a budget deficit of something like 10 to 11%. Even if Saudi Arabia continued to provide $30 billion, which I'm not sure it will do, it may come with conditions, political conditions, which it would not have come under from Abdullah. So that's one direction. The second generation are the meetings that have been taking place and the statements and the shifts. One of them is the very interesting statement by Egypt's eternal Foreign Minister Turki Al-Faisal about
Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia.
Yes, Saudi Arabia, about the Brotherhood, and saying the Brotherhood are not our enemies. That's very interesting, because actually for many years he really came from the opposite group. That, I don't think, that statement would not have appeared accidentally or casually. But one can build too much meaning in that. What will happen to Egypt as a result, I have no idea, except that I think that one thing that's happening is that Sisi, or the model of the strong, what Sisi is saying is, I'm your man, I'm the Rottweiler, I'm the guy who will crush Islamism in all its forms. The jihadis and the Brotherhood, they're all the same. I'm your man. I'm the stability man. Well, he's looking much less like the stability man and looking much more like the instability man. And I think we're not talking about a change of ideology or a change or any liking for the Brotherhood, but we're talking about hard, pragmatic thought by people who see in Saudi Arabia that the previous regime's policies are not working. And Yemen is an absolutely classic case of a policy backfiring. How can a sectarian government which does not treat its I think sectarian. I think you've got to be careful of how you use the word sectarian, because sectarianism was certainly used by Mubarak, certainly when it came to the attacks against the Copts. I'm not saying that there aren't sectarian elements certainly in some areas amongst Islamists, whether it's Brotherhood or not, or whether there was a concerted campaign after Rabaa to burn churches in Minya, is a very, very difficult question to answer. I'm not sure one can talk about that. One knows there was always trouble in Minya anyway. And so to view this thing in sort of absolutist terms and say the Brotherhood are sectarian, number one, two, that in no circumstances can they shelter and treat minorities as equal citizens is again one of these what-if questions that is constantly asked about the Brotherhood, when you have an absolute stack of evidence about exactly how much sectarian behaviour and repression is being conducted by various dictators and how they use it. We have a mountain of evidence like that. So the what-if questions interest me less. Sorry.
I mean, can I just address this last question as well about sectarianism? I would agree with David, and I think it's very difficult to see at least Hamas's rule within a sectarian lens. I mean, Hamas has never defined itself necessarily or explicitly within the sectarian divide. It has direct relations with Iran, even though it's a Sunni movement. So it's straddled that sectarian divide and doesn't define itself in that way. And it has actually been quite open to the protection of minority rights under its rule and to having women on its political platform. It's after it engaged with the democratic process and after the international community put on an international blockade against Hamas that it began moving into a more authoritarian role. And this is where Rosemary's comment is quite relevant. There are international factors at play here that are not directly from within Hamas's approach to governance, but very much influenced by the external environment.
Thank you very much, and a warm thanks to our speakers.